Hi, I'm Orgonite and welcome to my channel. Tonight we're going to be making a pyramid called Jewel of the Nile, as seen here. So join me as we make it. Okay, so for today's video, I want to begin by talking about colorants for resin. In my last video, the Chakra Glows pyramid, I used candy colors, which is basically a food coloring, for my resin because the alcohol inks are meant for epoxy resin and I use polyester casting resin. And the alcohol ink in epoxy resin gives a really neat effect, a blooming effect, like they call it petri dish. And I did a test last night with the alcohol inks on polyester casting resin, and while they don't have the petri dish effect, they do color it, and quite nicely, I would say. So I totally could have used that in my Chakra Glows pyramid, but better late than never. So I want to start by telling you what you'll need to make this piece. And just as we've been talking about, I have the alcohol ink set here, and we're going to use this to color our layers. And the gemstones we'll be using are quartz crystal, clear quartz crystals. And for my main crystal, I have a quartz crystal like this, and I've wire wrapped it with 18 gauge copper wire. And you will need some resin. I have polyester casting resin, which comes in a big gallon jug, and it's not easy to pour small amounts from, so I keep mine in a jar. You will also need several mixing cups and several sticks for your various colors, because we don't want them to mix. Also 2 measuring cups, one for your resin and one to weigh your gemstones, and also a kitchen scale to weigh your gemstones. It's not absolutely necessary, but it helps. And also the pyramid mold, which has a removable silicone insert of the pyramid, and the housing, which makes it steady and allows it to be level. So now that we know what we need to make this piece, why don't we go ahead and get started with our first layer. So I'm going to start out with 1 ounce. 1 ounce of resin. You can totally use epoxy resin if that's what you have, but I'm using polyester casting resin, and it goes a little bit faster in pyramid making than the epoxy resin. But epoxy resin will still work just fine. Just take you a little bit longer is all. And if you're using the polyester casting resin, you'll have the hardening drops. I'm not sure exactly how many drops it suggests, but what I've been using for the longest time is 9 drops to start and 9 drops for every ounce thereafter. So I'm going to use 18 drops in my 1 ounce of clear casting resin. And when you're mixing up your resin and your epoxy 2-part resin or your polyester casting resin with hardening drops, you want to make sure to stir that really good, especially if you're using the epoxy. You want to stir that for at least 2 minutes. And for the polyester casting resin, you want to just at least make sure that it's clear. And I typically do not have bubbles with my polyester casting resin, but if you're worried about bubbles, I suggest a heat gun You can also use one of those long lighters with quick passes over your resin just to get those bubbles to pop. When I pour mine, I can see several bubbles in there, but by the time I come back and it's hardened, there aren't any bubbles. So I don't use those steps, but if you feel you'd like to do that, please feel free. So I'm gonna start the top of my pyramid with, we're gonna use the purple alcohol ink, and I'm just going to put maybe one drop is enough. Let me stir it. I'm thinking of doing another drop. Okay. I'm still gonna do another drop. I want it to be a nice rich color, even though it's a small amount of resin. I still want it to be nice and rich. So 3 drops of resin, 3 drops of the alcohol ink in 1 ounce of resin. So I'm just gonna pour this in. I'm just gonna pour a little bit in at first and then position my crystal in the center, because we want to make sure that it's gonna stand up. This one keeps wanting to fall over. I am not having an easy time with this. You know what I'm gonna do? I better do it quickly so my resin doesn't harden, but I'm going to wire wrap 3 more crystals and put those in there, because this is gonna lay on its side. So I'm gonna put 3 more crystals in there to put a crystal on every corner of that of the pyramid. We'll see how that looks. Okay, so I now have 3 more wrapped crystals, and I'm just going to stick them at every corner of the top of this pyramid. And then I'm going to finish pouring in my purple resin. And just pour it all the way in. And join me for the next step. Okay, before we get to our second layer, I wanted to let you know something that I forgot to tell you in the first segment, and that is we will also be needing metals, whether you want to use leafing or brash shavings or aluminum shavings. Take your pick, it's up to you. Today I'm using brass shavings. This particular set of shavings is really fine, and I wouldn't buy this kind again. I like the more rustic look of the brass shavings that come from key makers. That's my favorite, but you know, I have this, so I'm going to use it. You know, don't want it to go to waste. And as far as my clear quartz crystals are concerned, I probably have about a ½ pound in here, and we're gonna use it all, I'm pretty sure. So let's get going with our second layer. And I'm going to pour 1 ounce of resin into my mixing cup. And with 1 ounce of resin, we're going to add 18 drops of hardener. The next color that I'm going to use for this layer is orange, and I'm gonna go ahead and start out with 3 drops, and we'll see how that looks. I think 3 drops is good. It's a nice rich color. and I think it's gonna look good. And just to make note, there aren't any bubbles from my last layer. I just wanted to point that out. There's one place that looks like a bubble, but it's actually the end of one of the crystals. So, and also I want to mention, before you pour your resin into your previous resin, you want to test it out and make sure that it has congealed. Because I've almost poured resin into another color that had not congealed and it would have blended. And unless you want that effect, it's not going to be good. So definitely test that out before pouring more resin in. So I used about 24 grams of the clear quartz crystal in there, and we're just gonna go ahead and let that set up until it's hardened, and then we'll add our brash shavings. And I will see you in about 45 minutes to an hour. Okay, so it's been about 45 minutes, and let's just test. Yep, it has congealed. So we're gonna start by pouring in some of our brash shavings. Just give it a nice good covering. It probably would have been better had I started by pouring a little resin in there first. We may have to mix it up just a little bit when we pour the resin in. But we're pouring our third layer, and I'm going to start with about 1.5 ounces of resin. So with 1.5 ounces of resin, I think I'm gonna do about 24 drops of hardener. So for this layer, we're going to be using red. I used 3 drops. But since we're using a little more resin in this section, I just want to make sure that that's going to be enough. We might want to hit it with another drop. I think 3 drops should cut it. It looks rich enough. I don't want it to get too dark, so I'm going to leave that as it is and go ahead and pour that in. So I'm just going to take my mixing stick and blend the brass in here just a little bit at the edges, because otherwise the resin might not be able to break through, and it'll have bare shavings on the outside of the pyramid. So that's why I'm just kind of stirring it up a little bit, and it will settle back down. But mainly at the edges is where it's important. So I used about 30 grams of my quartz crystals in there, and we're just gonna let that set up and come back and do our brash shavings in our next layer. Join me then. Okay, it's been 45 minutes, and it's now time to do our next layer. Just gonna test it, and it has congealed. I think we should do 2 ounces for this layer. pour it in my mixing cup. And for 2 ounces of resin, we should do 27 drops of hardener. Okay, now time to add our color. This layer is going to be blue, which this is a nice like turquoise aqua type blue. It's really pretty. I put in 3 drops. I'm going to see if that's enough. I'm going to do 1 more drop, so that's 4. And so I'm just going to pour a little bit just to get the floor of it covered. Perfect. Just enough so that we can add our brash shavings. So I'm just going to sprinkle those. A nice good layer of them. And then we'll go ahead and pour the rest of our resin over top of the brash shavings. That way we don't have to mix them up. And now time to add our gemstones. Okay, and we're back for what I thought was going to be the last layer, but I have done some thinking, and it's not going to be quite big enough, so I want to put a layer of beach sand at the bottom. That always grounds it out nicely. So we're going to pour 3 ounces of resin. So with 3 ounces of resin, we're going to need 36 drops of hardener. So for this layer, we are using sapphire blue, which is like a really nice deep blue. I put 4 drops in, and we'll see if that's enough. Yeah, I think that's going to be rich enough, so I'm just going to pour enough to cover the floor here so we can add our brash shavings. Now I'm just going to pour the rest. That was about 60 grams of gemstones, and I'm just going to sneak a little bit more in there. And yeah, we're just going to let that congeal, and I'll come back and do the layer of sand that I wanted to do, and then we'll let it harden. Welcome back. It's time to do our final layer, and while we're talking about layers, I want to explain to you why we're doing this in layers. Orgonite is made up of layers of crystals, metals, and gemstones, and these layers act as a filtration device to protect us from EMF radiation coming from cell phones, Wi-Fi towers, and 5G technologies. And the more layers you have, the better. So that's why I wanted to get all these layers in, and I'm going to ground it out with some beach sand. And beach sand is actually made up of little tiny quartz crystals. So it fits in perfectly, and I think it grounds it out nicely. So we are going to add somewhere between 3.5 and 4 ounces of resin to this layer. I'm gonna just do 4. And to 4 ounces of resin, we are going to add 45 drops of hardener. I didn't pour all of my resin in, but I'm going to start adding sand, and I have about 230 grams of sand here. I don't know that we'll use it all. You just want to use your mixing stick to get the sand incorporated into the resin. And when sand is in the resin, it's going to have a wet look. Anything that you put in resin is going to look wet. But that's okay. I think it still looks good. So I probably used about 3 ounces of resin for this sand layer. Yeah, and let's see how much sand we ended up using. Like 150 grams of sand. And I'm just gonna let that harden overnight, and I will be back in the morning to demold it. And good morning, it's time to demold our piece. It's special. I like it. It's got the 4 crystals that we put on all the corners, and I bet it would look really pretty with sun coming through it. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between the different colors, and the brass is kind of in the way. Maybe I should use leafing next time. I don't know. I like it. I like it, and I like the sand down at the bottom. So what I need to do now is I need to sand these rough and rugged edges, and then we'll put some feet on. Just for the record, I prefer using an emery board to do my sanding, but if you would prefer to use sandpaper, be my guest. I like the emery boards because it's easier to control. But if you have sandpaper, then go ahead and use that. And I buy these emery boards 10 to a pack. And now it's time to put on our feet, which are cabinet dampening bumpers, little 1/2-inch circles, little pads, and we're just going to stick them on the corners of our piece here. Okay, so we are finished with our piece. I think I'm gonna call it Jewel of the Nile. It's got the beach sand on there and the pyramid. And it's jewel tone colors. I think that's the perfect name for it. So I hope you like it. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. It makes me super happy when you do that. And subscribe to my channel for more great Orgonite projects. I'm going to close this video with pictures of other Orgonite projects that I look forward to doing with you. And don't forget to hit that notification bell to find out when new Orgonite projects are released. This is Orgone Nick. Thanks for joining me here today in my Orgonite studio. Have yourself an amazing rest of your day.